All right, so working with clay, it's really easy to not recall exactly what consistency you need. So let's just talk about like what is workable and what's not. So first off, I have really dry. So this is on the leather hard stage, meaning if I'm trying to bend it, it's going to start to crumble. And so this just is not workable anymore. It is usable if I needed, if I already had it shaped and I wanted to, say, paddle it, right? So I can get some shaping done, but I'm not going to be able to like coil it, build it, mold it. Really, it's now crumbly. If it was just a chunk of clay like this and I still wanted to be able to use it, it is still recyclable. So you could wrap it with a damp towel and then check back on it. Or if you let it dry all the way to become bone dry, which remember is where it's most fragile state, it is really the palest, state of it. If you just soak this in water, it will become slip. Then you can let it dry a little bit, remove some of the water, and it will come back into clay. So we can go over that at a later date. You might also, the clay you get out of the bag might be perfectly workable. So this is what you ideally want. So you can see it is nice and pliable, right? When I try to bend it, it's bending fairly easily without cracking. It's not so sticky that when I squish it in my hands, I'm not getting a bunch of it left over on my hands, right? But it is sticky, so I do feel like a tack to it when I squish it. Right, so this is ideally what you want. Sometimes if you've sprayed your bag down since you last used it, it might be a little wet on the outside, like a kind of film. But if I were to kind of mix it together, right, remember wedging is where you're kneading the clay together. This is a small amount of clay. I find it's a little easier to wedge a larger amount, but when I wedge it, I will usually be able to incorporate that slight outside tackiness to it if it's a little wet. Now, if I really sprayed it down a lot, I might have oversaturated that part of the bag. So if I find myself with clay that's really too wet, like this, so it's really starting to turn into slip, right? So this is not workable. It's just gonna like kind of goop around. So you have a few options. One, if it's just on the surface, you could try and scrape that off and use it as slip or put it back to dry out. But you can see as I try and shape this, it's not going to ever hold shape because it's oversaturated. So a few ways that you can deal with this is if it's like the entire piece of clay like this one is, I could just flatten it out a little bit and maybe I just like set it upright to dry a little, and it really depends on how long this is going to take based on how humid it is that day, how humid it is in the room, and how hot it is. So don't assume that how fast it dried one day is going to be the same as the next day. You do need to keep an eye on it. So I like to let things dry out when I'm working on something else, so I can kind of keep an eye on them. So I would set them to the side depending on how big my workspace is, and then I'd work on something else. Obviously this is a little too close, but you get the idea of like setting it somewhere where you can kind of babysit it. So again, just to review, you want something that is not super wet and tacky. You can see it's got a slight sheen to it in the light, but it is not like glossy like with water, right? A common mistake I see is somebody wants to smooth it and they'll actually just add water just like I did to smooth it. And yes, while it does create a smooth surface, it sometimes won't if your clay has some sand in it or other added material, because what will happen is you'll start to take away that thin layer of clay, the really fine particles. They're going to come off with this smoothing action, and then you're going to be left with those rougher materials. The other thing that's going to happen is if I continue to do this, I'm still going to end up with oversaturated clay, because every time I'm smoothing, some of that water is getting absorbed into the clay. So I'm oversaturating it slowly over time. So if you want to smooth something, a better tool would be either if you have like a rubber or a metal rib. Those are great. I actually really am a fan of old gift cards or credit cards, those plastic cards, or even just like a flat sheet of plastic I find can work really well. And the nice thing is that you can cut them to any shape or design that you want. Don't forget that when you're attaching your clay, even if it's super wet, I could probably stick this together and it would most likely stay, especially if I really compress it back on. But it's always better safe than sorry to score your clay, one piece to the other. So a few tools, if you have a needle tool, you could score it. I don't use a regular sewing needle just because it's so easy to lose. A scoring tool would be this kind of toothy blade, and that's convenient. A fork also works, or even a stick, or this happens to be just a broken popsicle stick, and it just happened to break with a really nice kind of toothy edge to it. So I actually have found that this is a really nice way to score as well. And sometimes if you get then this kind of goop on it, I can dip it in some water and kind of get instant slip because it grabs onto some of that water. So just don't forget to score, add some slip, or create some slip with some water and additional scoring, score the other side, attach together, right? So I've scored both. I've put slip in between. It's kind of like a sandwich, right? Score, slip, score. And then the last thing is to seal. I kind of wiggle it on there. And if you're not going to plan to see this design, then you would smooth it down. And so notice, even though I added some water with my kind of dipped water and scoring to create that slip, remember that's like our glue, I didn't get it so saturated that the water is squishing out when I added this on. Sometimes that can happen, in which case I wouldn't be able to smooth this down without smearing a lot of water, so I would just have to wait a second. All right, so just remember when you're working with your clay, if it's oversaturated, it's too wet to work with. If it's dry and crumbly, it's too wet to work with. Clay is a little bit like Goldilocks. It needs to be just right.